Hello students. You are aware that Karl Marx had depicted the state as an instrument of coercion in the hands of the ruling class. But even without adopting a Marxist perspective to the understanding of the state, we all know that coercion is a necessary attribute of any state. Force or coercion, in fact, is regarded as an essential attribute of the state because the state is the only organization which has the right to legitimate use of force. But coercion has a dual character. While it guarantees the perpetuation and reproduction of domination and order, it also suppresses challenges to state authority. In the course of time, it helps to create conditions that allow for voluntary obedience to laws and their legitimation. That is why Antonio Gramsci drew attention to the concept of hegemony on part of the state or the hegemonic role of the state. But coercion also has a negative aspect. Coercion undermines legitimacy. Continuous or unrestricted use of force to suppress dissent or resolve social conflicts and maintain order may simultaneously lead to the erosion of legitimacy and undermine the capacity of the state to rule. Thus, the state stands in a paradoxical situation regarding the use of force. It may ensure compliance, but at the same time, the frequency of its use may delegitimize the state. Therefore, we see that the state embodies a coercive cum legitimation process. The role of the state in the maintenance of law and order in society can be understood as a coercive cum legitimation process. All states rest on a combination of coercion and legitimacy and seek to use force in such a way that the legitimacy of law increases and the need to use the coercive power of the state, that is force, becomes less and less. In a democratic state in particular, striking such a balance is a delicate affair, and it depends to a great extent on what has been called political crafting. The stability of a democratic state depends on the way it responds to social conflicts arising in society and the way it uses force to resolve or settle them. So, regarding the relationship between the state and the process of modernization or socio-economic change that has been pervasive across the world, several scholars have pointed out that, for instance, Samuel Huntington argued that social and economic change, urbanization, increases in literacy and education, industrialization, education expansion, expansion of mass media, broaden political participation. Political institutions must expand and adopt to incorporate this increasing participation or face breakdown. Even in the liberal framework, I was referring to many of the views of different scholars. After Huntington, you can also consider the liberal approach, which says that broad participation is supposed to enhance stability via strengthened commitment and legitimacy. What was not adequately envisaged, however, by all these approaches is that how participation would raise the aspirations of the people and become the source of the greatest challenge to the state. With reference to India, Rajni Kothari argues that the state is facing the greatest challenge from those very people who are being increasingly politicized by the expansion of democracy but are dissatisfied with the pace of socio-economic change. Kothari finds that lopsided development, together with lack of emphasis on institutionalizing democratic norms, have rendered the Indian state weak and vulnerable to a variety of social challenges. Organic linkages between people's aspirations and the translation of those aspirations into performance have weakened the state democratic institutions. The consequence, the result is that the state assumes confrontational postures vis-a-vis the various sections of the population described in caste, ethnic, or regional terms. The social scene then becomes marked by increased violent protest and agitations, and this clearly confers on the role some kind of a confrontationist posture. High stateness in India became discernible from the time of India's independence. It is associated with its imperial legacies and the requirements of an interventionist managerial state pursuing welfare and socialist objectives. The claim that the state has a special relationship to the public good and the state's interest is uniquely identified with the public interest, and that the interests of social groups are narrow, partial, and selfish, and this dates from the early 1970s. India became a republic, casting aside the autocratic monarchical doctrines and administrative state of king, emperor, and viceroy. India was also a democracy whereby for the first time the political masters, those who represent and govern, were chosen on the basis of universal adult suffrage. And India was also a welfare and a socialist state committed not only to economic growth and self-reliance, but also, most important, to social justice and national power. So what has been the impact of colonialism on the formation of the Indian state and its high stateness in the initial years after independence? The causes behind the lack of economic growth and industrialization in the initial decades of India's independence include, first, that the state the Indians inherited from the colonial past was modern and democratic, yet not all that effective as an economic actor. The Indian state did not perform very well as an economic agent. Second, India's mass national movement developed in opposition to the colonial state as a vehicle for capturing state power. The political process helped to create a sense of nation in India and generated political values that placed premium simultaneously on democracy and on statist development. And India came to embody gradually a multi-class social base. While India's national movement was a powerful oppositional force, it never developed a corresponding organizational structure, such as a tightly knit political party or even a coherent political strategy that would allow it to redesign the state in accordance with its developmental ambitions. The multi-class social base also made for a movement that had to reconcile many competing forces as it sought to define its ideology, policies, and political strategies. In fact, what is interesting that in case of India, the whole idea of the nation was a negative response. It was negative in the sense that it was born out of hatred against a common enemy, and it was this negative factor which consolidated the otherwise fragmented elements of the Indian polity. But the attainment of independence and the concomitant departure of the colonial rulers exposed the fragility and the fragmentary character of the multi-class Indian state. And I am going to develop from this later on when I will show to you that such a weak state also tries to generally assume some kind of a confrontationist role, which gives it the garb of coercion. And this was subsequently unable to enunciate and execute developmental policies and programs based on consensus, which explains the low trajectory of economic progress that followed. As Kohli puts it, the result was a fragmented multi-class sovereign state whose developmental inefficacy has remained at the heart of India's lackluster economic performance. So this is this weak and insecure state which also desired the state to adopt or imbibe some kind of a coercive role. Finally, the Indian subcontinent was for a long time characterized by low technology, low productivity agrarian economy. The political instability of the 18th and the early 19th centuries resulted in the absence of any spontaneous economic progress. And in this situation, the state seeks to make itself predominant in society. Joel Migdal focuses attention on the effort of the state to make itself prominent in society as seen in terms of the successful subordination of political inclinations of social behavior or behavior sought by other social organizations in favor of behavior prescribed by state rulers. The major struggles in most societies are over who has the right to make the countless rules that guide social behavior. So coercion is based on the need of the state to gain compliance. When the state attempts to enforce its rules, it automatically comes into conflict with other social organizations. The result of this conflict is not necessarily predominance of the state, but situations of accommodation between the state and the others. Legitimation, together with compliance and participation, are seen as indicators of increasing levels of social control by the state. Migdal argues that the tenacity of these social groups and their leaders, whom he calls strongmen, can enrage determined state leaders and easily encourage them to use coercive methods to gain compliance. The case of Mrs. Indira Gandhi at the time of emergency is an apt illustration of this reality. And the state comes to embody increasing social controls. What is seen is that the state, through enactment of various laws, is increasingly acquiring the authority to confine people without trial. The Preventive Detention Act of 1950 remained on the statute books till 1970 and appeared again in the form of Maintenance of Internal Security Act of 1971, which was repealed in 1977. In 1980, the National Security Act was enacted and two amendments followed in 1984, making the position of detainees even more vulnerable. Several new laws have been cited for incorporating provisions that curb individual freedom and make the arbitrary use of power legally possible. So these curbs, such arbitrary use of power, obviously is a threat to the liberty of the people. So are these curbs on liberties acceptable? Because they jeopardize individual freedom. Draconian laws that curb liberties are interpreted by many to be an aid and catalyst for security and not an instrument for destruction. That is how the argument is usually posited. The coercive processes of the state machinery, as also of the fact of bail provisions becoming more stringent, are welcomed with a sense of relief, notwithstanding the fact that the dangers of abuse are much more grave. Okay? So what actually appears to be safeguards of liberty can well become points which will threaten liberty. The perceived threats to national integrity appear to justify, in the minds of many, the continuing empowerment of the state and its executive, notwithstanding the fact that the process may in the long run be more destructive of the legitimation of the state. So is a coercive state, and this is the point I was making earlier, is a coercive state also an insecure state? This is particularly true when it is accepted that a weak and insecure state cannot only turn more fascist in its methods, but can help generate a mindset, particularly among its slightly better off citizens, that all dissent and protest activity is anti-state, anti-national, and inherently destabilizing, and therefore should be put down with a heavy hand. So the state, in trying to be a guardian of liberty, ends up ultimately stifling it. So is this high stateness that we see in India from the initial years after independence, is it getting reduced or compromised with the onset of globalization? With the inauguration of the liberalizing regime at the onset of globalization, many suspect that the state is in the process of abandoning many of its earlier role involving high stateness and reconciling itself to a more withdrawn or restrained actor. Rajni Kothari draws attention to diverse types of erosion that the nation state in India is facing today. First, there has been underway an erosion of the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of the people of India, both in respect of its standing in the eyes of those who for long depended on it for their well-being, and also in respect of its credibility in the eyes of others, the middle-class professionals and the media in particular. With regard to the erosion of the state in India, we can also see that the mounting challenges to central authority by a whole array of regional movements of both autonomy and separatism have rendered the state an arena of growing conflicts and violence. Third, there has also taken place an erosion of the whole conception of a distinctive and overriding role of the Indian state, both vis-a-vis other centers of power within the country. These other centers could include industry, labor, religion, caste, linguistic and ethnic identities, and vis-a-vis external interests like the dominant centers of geopolitical and strategic power, international financial institutions, transnational structures of capital and commerce, all of whom have emerged as big players in the field of economic globalization unfolding across the world. The state, along with the erosion that we have seen, seems also be in some kind of a retreat. The state in India, instead of occupying center stage in the social and economic arenas, is also seen to be in retreat. This is obvious particularly in the economic sphere, a trend that has been visible since the 1980s with the onset of liberalization, and which trend has intensified in the post-1991 era, that is commonly referred to as the age of reforms, but is also true in the social sphere in matters such as providing opportunities to the minorities, the backward classes, tribal communities, and women and children. Encouraging people's initiatives and indigenous thinking in key areas such as education, environment, health and housing, and generally in matters of implementation of laws of the land for the betterment of the poor and oppressed sections of the society who are finding it difficult to rely more and more on the state. So is the state abandoning its responsibilities? Doesn't seem so. Fears and apprehensions about the state abandoning its role in the domain of public welfare in the wake of globalization were sought to be assuaged as early as 1997 by Manmohan Singh, who said that programs of social development, anti-poverty programs, education, health and rural housing received special attention, particularly after 1992-93 when the age of reforms took off. So we come across an altered scenario regarding the nature of the Indian state, and that will also help us to understand its coercive role in subsequent years. Kothari draws attention to three trends. First, there is a marked rise of sub-national consciousness overtaking the earlier kind of nationalism that included diverse regional and cultural identities. There is a growing revolt against the central authority as well, in some areas against state governments, producing a highly unstable situation. Second, we see that the national elite, as it becomes more and more unable to cope, tends to turn away from basic political challenge of nation building and the related economic challenge of development, and turns to international and transnational agencies to bail them out of the crisis. And third, there has been the rise of new organizational forms that are transcending states and nations. These consist of transnational corporations possessing enormous financial and technological resources, and a series of bilateral and multilateral compacts providing for regimes of security, and they are together producing a new institutional apparatus for running the entire world, which is called a world order. And in this context, in appreciating this altered role of the state and the way it gets involved in coercive entanglement with other groups, subnational groups in society, we refer to the case of the Forest Rights Act, the interesting case of the FRA. On the one hand, there are some who believe that the Forest Rights Act is basically a political move on part of the state to cover up its failure on the development front and shift focus to its commitment to democracy and human rights. This is important in an age of globalization when India, along with its pursuit of higher economic growth, must also display both nationally and internationally its concern for and commitment to the plight of the poor and the marginalized segments of the population. The skeptics further argue that visibly engaged in the path of development, as India is today, contemplation and implementation of various developmental projects for mining dams, establishment of special economic zones, etc., will be on the rise, and that can only mean that there will be more cases of displacement leading to further expropriation and pauperization of the non-elite rural people. So, in such a scenario, the Forest Rights Act seems to be a victory of the politically marginalized in India, like the tribals. There are those who feel that the Forest Rights Act is a commendable and a rare case of politically marginalized groups like the forest-dwelling tribals and the forest-dependent poor, extracting a concession from the political elite. It could well be an indication that the politicized poor are becoming increasingly influential, and that they are becoming more capable in terms of defending and extending their autonomous spaces within India's political economy. Their economic security or pauperization in the days to come will depend in good measure upon their ability to safeguard and protect both their private and common property on which their livelihood depends. So, it seems clear that these marginalized sections are gradually mastering the strength to deal with the coercive apparatus of the state and try and address the coercive apparatus of the state in their own ways and come up with legislation that will be conducive to their interests. And this tells us about the rise of demand groups and issue politics in India. Rudolph and Rudolph comment interestingly that interest group representation in India is marked by pluralist rather than corporatist forms and processes. Demand groups are a form that interest representation can take in competitive, open democracies when political mobilization of mass publics, and we have just seen the Forest Rights Acts as a case of political mobilization of such mass politics, they can outstrip or overflow the formal institutions of the political process. They are an expression of movement and issue politics. Such demand groups have been found to operate not primarily in institutionally defined policy arenas, but rather with an inclination to symbolic and agitational politics. So, how has the coercion of the state been dealt with? Rise of agitational politics and power negotiations perhaps offers an insight in this respect. Through ad hoc and spontaneous tactics, including public dramas such as padayatras, hartals, rasta rokos, these are forms of anomic behavior, meaning marches, strikes, roadblocks, respectively. Such demand groups have been able to mobilize support in favor of their cause and interest. They have been also able to influence public opinion and wrangle concessions, advantages, and gains from the state. Atul Kohli therefore comments that the 50-year history of the sovereign Indian Republic is replete with instances of power negotiations. Most significantly, within the framework of a centralized state, accommodation of group demands has repeatedly strengthened India's democracy. And that is why, in examining the coercive use of state power, one also comes across the interesting development of new social movements. One has in fact witnessed in India a spate of new social movements which are important in terms of the void they fill, where the state and other social and cultural institutions are unable or unwilling to act in the interest of their members. Social movements step in where institutions do not exist, or when they fail to serve or violate and contradict people's interests. So, in a burgeoning democracy like India, people's movements have been gathering momentum. People have taken to the streets, they have been able to articulate their interests, and they have been able to not only sensitize people at large about the legitimacy of their interests, they have also made several inroads into the legislature through lobbying and other tactics. They have tried to gather the support of various non-governmental organizations, and armed with all these arsenal, they have been able to wrangle concessions from the Indian state. And therefore, we see growing assertiveness in India of the marginalized and the poor. Pranab Bardhan makes an interesting observation. He says that in many parts of India, the poor have started questioning slowly, with growing assertiveness, what has been one of history's most well-entrenched and ornately elaborate ideological systems of legitimizing inequality and exploitation. This questioning becomes more acute with the expansion of the market nexus. So, it is not entirely up to the state anymore to use unilaterally its coercive apparatus and come down heavily on the people. The people, by the strength of their numbers, they are also trying to make their voices audible, and they are in a position today to try and negotiate and deal with the state to wrangle the concessions they rightly deserve and demand. So, in conclusion, we can say that the new social movements today mobilize people in pursuit of common interests. One may thus view in the legislation of the Forest Rights Act, which is considered to be a landmark piece of legislation, an indication of the maturing of Indian democracy from a centralized, elitist, even statist domain to a decentralized, participatory, mass-based plane. Even in situations where the state is apt to neglect its welfare commitment, we have seen in the earlier phases of India's independence, we have seen that the state assumed a high degree of stateness and centralization because it embarked on a role of welfarism and socialist commitment. But gradually, although the onset of the liberalization age has diluted that stateness in India, the state has withdrawn. The state has also come to recognize that it has to also pay due respect and attention to the interests and the needs of the growing numbers who have been rendered an unfair deal with the onset of the liberalizing regime. And therefore, even in situations where the state is apt to neglect its welfare commitment, such turmoil from below and messy politics in an open and burgeoning polity like India becomes apparent, and this can go a long way in prodding the state to live up to its various commitments vis-a-vis the people, particularly its welfare role. In fact, the case of the emergence of the Forest Rights Act bears testimony to this fact. Thank you.